Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. It's been a fun reading week and we're now in booker season, so some of my reading will now become a bit more of that. But in the meantime, here are the books I've been reading this week, and I hope you are having a good week yourselves. First up, a book that I've been very excited to read and was kind of hoping would be on the Booker long list. The Artist by Lucy Steeds, and I really loved this. So this book is a very tense and sort of slow burning book. Essentially, we are introduced to an artist called Edouard Tartuffe. He is working in France. He's a very celebrated painter, and he is accompanied by his niece, at least how she's sort of presented in the book for the most part at the beginning, called Etty. And together they live this sort of quite odd life. Edouard Tartuffe is this very difficult figure known as Tartar during the book, who is a very sort of boisterous and tricky man in many ways. He wants everything done his way, and he wants it to kind of he needs Etty to basically do that for him. She essentially runs the house, she does all of his finances, all of those sorts of things. And Etty is this quite, at least how we meet her at the beginning of the book, quite a timid young woman who seems to very much live in the shadow of Tartar. She has quite a small frame of reference for the world. The furthest she's gone is Avignon, and that was a while ago, and that feels like she'd gone on a global journey, whereas really she sort of travelled to a big city not too far away. And so we learn about them, especially through the character Joseph coming in. He is someone who's come to write an article about Tartar and ends up being more enmeshed in their lives. Particularly at the beginning, he is used as a model for a painting by Tartar, and more springs from that. And it's difficult to go into the rest of that without spoiling this book massively, but I think this is a really phenomenal piece of writing. I found it very tense and beautifully done, because we see constantly throughout that Etty has a lot more to her than is at first revealed. We get the sense that she's quite plucky and inventive and has all these other hopes and dreams and ambitions of her own, but is very much living as essentially as an accomplice or an assistant to Tartar, and it's very much framed through sort of male genius and, you know, all of those sorts of things. And the book then also does make some other really intelligent points about women in art throughout history, and the way that women were either kept out by not being allowed to attend certain art schools, or if they did, they had to, they were only allowed to do parts of what everybody else was doing, but also the ways that their work was devalued. And this book does a lot with that, again without spoiling anything, about how women's role in art has been devalued over the years. So I thought this was a really beautiful piece of writing. Next up, carrying on my prize reading for another prize, this time the Orwell Prize for Fiction, The Accidental Immigrants by Jo McMillan. And this is a book by an indie press, which also makes me happy. But essentially it's an incredibly gripping and tense and difficult book in many ways. So it takes as its core idea, essentially flipping on its head the typical immigrant narrative. So typically we read immigrant stories of people leaving, typically it's framed as sort of the global south, moving to the global north, particularly the US or Europe, and it being framed very much as, you know, they leave somewhere quite poor potentially, and they go into a place and they are they find it hostile at first, but ultimately it works out for them, yada yada. This book flips that on its head, and particularly lots of narratives around immigration, particularly far right narratives around immigration, by having this be an English couple, or at least a couple with British citizenship, on, I think it's fictional, a fictional-ish island called St. Mira. I don't know if it is real. It feels like it's based on a Greek island or on Cyprus, in some ways at least. But essentially St. Mira decides that it's had enough of tourists, of expats, of immigrants, of whatever. And it decides that it wants to essentially very quickly and abruptly close all of its borders externally and implement new rules for people who were not St. Mirren in some way. And what we start to see in this book is the way that the immigration forms are used in the book. So we see them sort of this typed out question and a handwritten answer. And we start to see the many loopholes, the many holes, hoops that people are forced to jump through, and particularly the ways that those feel increasingly unfair. So what starts as not needing to have any Greek language ability soon becomes needing to have a certain level, and then that level needs to be tested and given a certificate. But actually, if your certificate is too old, then you're no longer eligible and you need to retake that test. And that test has a price attached to it, but also there's a time factor. And now your application is caught in this slightly Kafkaesque thing of being even further and further away. And I think that's what I found really powerful and unnerving with this book, is the slow creep of this into the narrative. So what starts as somebody being able to say, well, actually, I have St. Mirren citizenship because I've been naturalized. Okay, well, now naturalization has been taken off the table. It's now no longer a thing. So what does that mean for you? You're now stateless. Or somebody previously could have 2 passports, now they're only allowed 1, and now they have to choose, and all of these other little things. And I thought this is what was so clever about the book, because it takes as its framing people who typically would not have to jump through these hoops, i.e. British people, for example, whose passports, we are in a very fortunate position that our passports are much less questioned than many other people across the world. And what we see is the inverse happening, where suddenly speaking English and having a British passport are things that are tricky on this St. Mirren island. So I found this really affecting for the way that this book slowly ups the ante and just feels increasingly suffocating in making its point. So I thought this was a really intelligent and thought-provoking read. Last but not least, something very different indeed, Nearly Departed by Lucas Oakeley. And I had this as an audiobook through NetGalley, and it was one of those books that I didn't really have any, I just thought it might sound interesting, it might be a nice lighter read compared to sort of some of the Booker and other prize reading I've been doing recently. And it's a very sweet book in many ways. So the idea is that essentially we have a young man whose name has now entirely left my brain, and his girlfriend Beth dies really unexpectedly, and in the aftermath of this, he is trying to process her grief. And it happens at some point in this process that 2 things really are apparent. One is he made a promise to Beth that after her death he would fall in love with somebody within 3 years, which is, odd to put a number on it, but it's just sort of a thing he said and feels that he has to honour in some way. And the second thing is that Beth is now a ghost who is able to communicate with him and essentially follows him around, exists around him. So he still feels like he's with Beth, but also there's a trickiness that goes into it. It's more of a kind of cozy romance book in some ways. I realise I say cozy romance and I'm talking about death, but there we go. But the whole idea with him having her as a ghost there is that she is essentially able to see what he's doing in his life, to try and guide him, but ultimately the thing she's trying to guide him towards is him falling in love again. It's very sweet and very cute in many ways. And it just was a nice other book to read that was just a lot sort of, again, fluffy feels like an insult, but was a sort of more of a romance style book to go alongside everything else. So I just thought it was very cute. And if you're looking for something slightly more, I say escapist. I don't know if reading a book about a dead partner is escapist, but a book that has a cutesy feel to it, then this may be for you. But this was definitely a nice other balancing kind of book alongside something a bit heavier like The Accidental Immigrants. So yes, I really enjoyed this. So those have been the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you're keeping really well, and take care and speak to you all very soon. Bye bye.